home is not necessarily one particular place defined by where exactly you happen to land on earth, like being born, but it is somewhere where you feel relaxed, to which you can relate very easily. And if it turns out that there is more than one place where you relate easily, as is indeed the case with me, then all these are your home.
Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome. My name is Ruth Wishart. It's my pleasure to be chairing this afternoon's event. Our guest, as you know, is a distinguished scholar, economist, philosopher, and not least Nobel laureate. He's one of the few academics who can boast of a glittering reputation in both Cambridges in England and indeed in Massachusetts. Over the years, his seminal works have included books on ethics, justice, development policy, and the thesis on welfare economics, which of course brought that Nobel Prize. He is then a polymath, a profound thinker who's formed his views through extensive reading of philosophers from all cultures. His latest book, Home in the World, is a memoir which discusses many of these theories interwoven by the early infancies of a childhood which was spent inter alia in India, Burma, and Bangladesh before arriving as an undergraduate at Cambridge at Trinity College, of which he later became master. He is then, in the precise sense of that term, a global citizen, a man of several worlds whose observations glow with originality, plurality, and humanity. And I could go on, but I'd only frighten myself. So instead, I'd ask you to give a warm Edinburgh International Book Festival welcome to Professor Amartya Sen. Good afternoon. Well, good morning. You're in America. Could I just start by asking, this memoir, Home in the World, Amartya, it ends when you're just in your early 30s, and we know you've done a lot of damage since then, so why stop then?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. It ends when I returned to India after being in England for a while. Is that what you were referring to?
But, I mean, was there any reason why you stopped your life and times in your early 30s when, you know, without being unkind, you're in the foothills of your prime now?
Yeah, I'm having some difficulty hearing. It's undoubtedly my age and my hearing being defective. Can you lost the question to me?
Okay, I was asking why you stopped when you were only 30-something. Why you stopped your memoir so early.
Right. No, I was there. That's exactly right. I returned to India and became a teacher at the Delhi School of Economics when I was exactly 30. And so the book ends there after my return, and I was worried about missing various things, not only England, but also my Pakistani friend. So I went via Pakistan to India. It's a very odd way of getting there. And then I got absorbed in teaching, and the book just touches my early teaching in Delhi, but it doesn't go further into it. Someday I may have to revisit that territory.
Well, I don't want to, I mean, there's so much in this book because it's not just about your childhood and your early youth and your early manhood. It's, of course, about all the philosophers of whom you've written extensively. But it's called Home in the World, and home for you is a lot of different places. So is home in your mind not so much a geographical entity as a state of mind?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the book actually begins with an interview with BBC, where the BBC interview, I think it was one of the hard talks, was telling me I have no concept of home since I didn't have a singular idea of home. And my home included where I grew up in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, where I was born, Santiniketan, and to which I returned at the age of 7 and be there for about 10 years studying. The home includes my going with my parents to Burma and being in Mandalay. And the home also includes my coming to Britain, feeling quite at home there too. I decided that home is not necessarily one particular place defined by where exactly you happen to land on earth, like being born, but it is somewhere where you feel relaxed, to which you can relate very easily. And if it turns out that there is more than one place where you relate easily, as is indeed the case with me, then all these are your home. And I think the homeliness that I appreciate and love, happily for me, doesn't come uniquely defined as a particular spot of town or village or city. So that's how the book begins, and quite a lot of the experiences I have in traveling around. It's I find that I can arrive at a place and find myself totally, if I may use the expression again, totally at home as where I am, and that includes India and Bangladesh and Burma and England and in America too, of which there is a little bit of a snippet since I taught at MIT for a year. So it's I don't know, we could debate whether I'm making a mistake. The BBC was completely convinced that I've been badly tutored on the idea of a home and didn't know what it meant. I would not accept that, and I would dispute the idea that one has to have only one home, which excludes all the other places, which could also.
No, I think you're just a very lucky man that home is wherever you hang your hat, and that's a gift not given to many people. I want to talk a little bit about some of the book, Amartya, because although it tells us fascinating detail about your upbringing and all of that, but it also, of course, takes us on a kind of dizzying journey through all the philosophical works that you've encountered in your academic life and before and after. And I'm just wondering if, are any one of these philosophers, would you say, was more important in terms of forming your own thinking than another? I mean, do you have a philosopher who sits on your shoulder?
Well, I think there are many philosophers come and go in my mind. When I was young, and I was very involved in studying Sanskrit, so ancient Indian thought and ancient Indian philosophy came quite a bit into my mind. Not so much what people study a lot, namely religious aspect of ancient Indian thought. In fact, quite the contrary. The materialist schools, the Lokayata, the mathematical studies which link philosophy with math, these were part of my attraction of ancient Indian thought that engaged me tremendously between the ages, I would say, 8 and 9 to the age of about 12 and 13. And then, of course, when I went to England, the philosophy of one of my teachers, Piero Sapa, made a big difference to me. And Piero Sapa had debates with Wittgenstein, a great philosopher in the conventional sense. And those debates were of importance to me too. The Wittgenstein had in fact just died when I arrived in England. But he left a very big mark in my thinking, in my days in England.
I want to talk a bit about your own personal values, because you say in the book, of course, that you detail when and why you became an atheist. But you've always been attracted in a kind of secular sense to Buddhism, and I'm wondering what it is about the Buddhist culture that has such a great appeal for you.
Yes, the Buddhist tradition is not really an atheistic one, it's an agnostic one. Actually, it's quite an interesting book, which I studied with enormous interest. It was written in 14th century AD, so fairly early in terms of modern era, but 14th century, of course, is quite late in terms of ancient Indian thought. It's called Sarvadarshan Sangaha, collection of all philosophy, written by someone called Madhvacharya, where in each chapter you examine a philosophical position very favorably, defend it, say what are the reasoning for adopting that outlook. And then in the next chapter, you move on and criticize what you have done the chapter before. So this goes on for, I've forgotten, 17 or 18 chapters. And the first chapter is on Lokayata, which is the atheistic materialist school of thought, and is probably one of the finest expositions of the atheistic philosophy. The second chapter is on Buddhism, and among the things Buddha is arguing against the Lokayata is to say that there is too much certitude in assuming that there is nothing, that atheism is the right position. Buddha remained an agnostic, and it was very striking to me that two of the lessons, of which there are many lessons, he offered that were important, very important for me. One was agnosticism, namely that you may ask the question, is there a God or not? You'll never be able to answer the question really fully to your complete satisfaction. And the second point was that you don't have to resolve that issue in order to decide what is morally the right thing to do. So in that sense, the fact that God is not needed is very different from many religious positions, including Christianity, of course. And Buddha argued that position, and that's the second chapter. And that's the way it proceeds. The later chapters are very theistic and concerned with what are the different ways of thinking about God. Now, I found all that totally riveting, and I was happy that I didn't have to take one particular position among them. They all seemed to me to have strong arguments, and indeed that was the point that Madhvacharya in the 14th century was making. So you're right, there is a Buddha connection, but it's a bit more complicated. Buddha being an agnostic is really in some way more skeptical of God compared with standard religions like Christianity or Islam.
I wonder if we could stick with religion for a moment, Amartya, because one of the things that you said in the book, which really struck home, especially just now in contemporary world politics just now, you said that to see political tolerance merely as a Western liberal inclination seems to me a gigantic error, and few people disagree with that. But on the other hand, I wonder how disappointed you are with the current Indian government and its treatment of Muslims, given that you've always argued for a plural, tolerant society.
Yes, I don't know what to say about the India's government position on religion. First of all, is deeply unjust and unfair to a number of beliefs. It privileges Hinduism in a very narrow form. I mean, Hindus also produce the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Gita, and so on. But here it takes the form of a very narrow-minded Hindu tradition, and any departure from it is seen as a mistake. And Islam in particular is placed under pretty nasty critique and various privileges of all other followers of religion are given greater weight than Islamic. So I think we don't have to rise to a very high level of religious thinking to see that the Indian government position is straightforwardly rejectable through reasoning, fairness, and any kind of idea of justice.
I wonder if I could just stick with that topic for a moment in another context, because you talked about your original time in Burma, Myanmar as it now is, and you talked about how welcoming and tolerant they were, and then you said that when there was the treatment that was given to the Rohingya Muslims, you said that the military in Burma had really used a form of brainwashing, of racist brainwashing. That was the only way you could explain how such a tolerant people, as you'd originally found them, suddenly behaved in the way they did. And you talk a lot about Aung San Suu Kyi and how she changed as well. And I wonder if you think she was also brainwashed, or what explanation you have for the stance that she took.
Yes. Aung San Suu Kyi is someone I tremendously admire, but also who eventually saddened me very strongly. I encountered her when she first came abroad, and that was to India, to Delhi. She did her first degree in Delhi. Then she went to Oxford. It so happened that both places I was present, and I knew her and her husband also quite well. And she, of course, had a military background. Her father was a big general, but also a big, broad-minded nationalist Burmese who wanted to make room for everyone who had any claim to a room in Burma for it. But over time, she had to take on the battle with the military. Initially, it was the military versus the people of Burma, and she led that fight for the people very well. But then the military learned the trick of divide and rule. That's quite a standard trick in imperialism, and there's a certain amount of that in the British Empire as well. But what they did was to separate out a group of Muslims, Rohingya, who had been resident in the area where they are now for hundreds of years, and described them as being not from Burma, not Burmese, and carried an intense propaganda, some of it old-fashioned, some of it quite new-fashioned, including things like the Facebook, and it generated an atmosphere where the Burmese population, mainly Buddhist, turned against this Islamic Rohingya group in an extremely unfair way. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi didn't really recognize how big a loss was coming her way. And so by the time she woke up to it, she couldn't be pro-Rohingya because the entire Burmese population had meanwhile turned so anti-Rohingya and anti-Muslim for that reason. So I think this is a piece of sadness, and I think I regret it so much since I'm such an admirer of Aung San Suu Kyi. But I think at some stage, she certainly what we might call, she dropped the ball, and now, of course, she has no standing at all, and the government has arrested her, denied her all kinds of rights. You know that from today's newspapers.
Well, ironically, of course, she's fallen foul of the military herself now.
She fallen
foul of the military herself.
Well, that's a simplification. It's true that what happened is that when the military offered her a compromise whereby she could have an election, and if she wins, could be formally the head of the country, he fell for it. I think that was a mistake. I don't think she was actually a militarist in any sense. But no, she didn't have the sagacity at that time to stand up against the military. And in many ways, it's a pity that while a great leader, she wasn't a Mahatma Gandhi who could see through the fog that is being laid in front of her, and she could have taken a better position. I wouldn't say she was a military compromise collaborator. On the other hand, she could have taken a much clearer, much better position on the military than she in fact did.
I want to pick up now, if I may, Amartya, on some of the themes that have been not just a constant in this book, but in your other writings as well. In particular, I'd like to start off with talking about justice. And you've said quite often, as you've said again in this book, that justice, the concept of justice, is almost impossible to define. But I'm wondering if we should, if the absence of injustice is the lodestar we should be following.
Yes, I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. And it is, in our common argumentation, quite standard to bring in examples of injustice to understand what justice is, to illustrate what justice is. But I don't really take the view that justice is really impossible to follow. It's sometimes easier to get examples of injustice than examples of justice being done. I accept that. On the other hand, I think the idea of justice and that of injustice, both of them are quite important. And justice comes with a positive promise of various things to various people. That when, for example, if you take India, when you have a caste system going more extreme, untouchability, then the way some people are treated is thoroughly unjust and totally unacceptable. But then when you have to ask the question, so what do you want? And to which you could say they should have not only the privilege that they would have otherwise had if they didn't come from that background, but also having had such a bad historical um, uh, background, uh, they need some kind of restitutive justice, and that's required affirmative action and so on. These are um, ways of mending the injustice and seeking justice in their life. So I would say both the idea of justice and injustice are important in our thinking, and they should be.
I wonder, I want to talk for a minute about one of your other most important themes throughout your life. Your book, Hunger and Political Action, for instance, underpinned an awful lot of fresh thinking in terms of development generally. Now, I wonder when you talk about things like social choice theory, when you talk about capacity and capabilities, I'm wondering what weight you would give to what I would call equality of opportunity.
Yeah, I think the equality of opportunity is a difficult idea, which those who want to make that the primary guide to fairness uh, tend often to overlook a bit because the opportunity can be defined in many different ways. Quite often, opportunities are defined about what happens to your life, assuming you are who you are. On the other hand, in being who you are, there are already many lack of opportunities arising from, say, your physical handicap or for being uh, um, affected by proneness to illness, uh, and which many people have. These are lack of opportunity, and they require positive uh, um, action in order to be appropriately um, treated. So I don't have anything against the idea of opportunity and equality of opportunity, excepting my claim is that if you really try to define the equality of opportunity in a fair way, taking into account both what you are born with, taking into account what you live with as a child, taking into account your family um, background and family inheritance, uh, and then what happens to you in terms of education and so on. It won't be such a simple idea. A lot of people like the idea of equality of opportunity because it looks like a good shortcut. My point is that it isn't a shortcut. We have to think about justice and injustice in a broad way, and opportunities, sure, will come into that. There is also a second problem that opportunities often indicate that if, despite the opportunities, you can't get there, you can't achieve all the things that you could have achieved possibly with those opportunities, uh, then it's your fault. But that it may not be. Not being able to use the opportunities you have may arise also from some lack of opportunity that you have, which arises from not being able to capture the privileges the advantages that could be yours if you have the clarity of thought and clarity of mind that is needed. So it's a complex idea. Nothing against the idea of opportunity, but I don't think I would treat it as a shortcut to justice.
Well, let me ask you again about another of your constant themes, which is you say at various points in the book and indeed in all your other works that a materialist society is not a healthy society, and that, and you argue against things like using GDP as some kind of indication of whether or not a society is healthy and wealthy. And that being the case, why do you suppose so many governments are still obsessed with things like GDP?
Well, I think GDP is a mesmerizing attraction to many people. And it has merit. So when you say, well, you talk about Poland and Ukraine, but when the war ended, they have similar GDP per capita. But now, and this is what the Polish nationalists might say, the GDP per capita in Poland is a great deal higher than GDP per capita in Ukraine. So if you say that, that's an achievement. On the other hand, there are many things that it wouldn't take into account. For example, with the same example, Poland, because it is a society where they are quite hostile to relationship of gay people. It's also, in a broader way, rather hostile to women's tradition vis-a-vis men. So there are things that, despite the high GDP, Poland may not have, and that may well be a problem to consider. So it's neither difficult to understand why the GDP appeals, nor is it hard to understand why ultimately it is a weak way of judging the success of a society. You need to judge how human beings are achieving their life in a way that doesn't leave them with disadvantage compared with others. So I think, yes, GDP has a position, and I would never deny that GDP is a good thing to do, good thing to study carefully. And when Joe Stiglitz and I and Fitoussi together did a report for Sarkozy on how to judge the progress of a nation, we did want GDP to be better estimated, but we can't stop there. We have to go beyond. So that's my position.
Okay, now I want to talk about a little more about hunger and about famine particularly, because early on in the book you were witness to an absolutely appalling famine in Bengal when you were very young. And not only was that an appalling famine, but it was a very underreported famine, as we know, and there was a kind of news blackout for a while. But you also talk in the book about famine, cereal famines in places like the African continent, where there is simultaneously plenty, and yet it has to coexist with famine. And another part of the book, which absolutely fascinated me, was about you talking about what happened in Britain, in the UK, after the Second World War, where they decided to avoid there being any kind of mass hunger or mass deprivation. They introduced rationing. Now, I cannot see in today's very materialistic world anybody ever trying to address problems of hunger and famine and poverty by rationing again. Can you?
Well, it depends on what role you attribute to it. You see, let's start with this, where you started, namely actual famine. Now, the reason why they don't occur in democracy is because a government will be held responsible for a famine, and famines are easy to prevent. But bear in mind that the number of people affected by a famine is never very large. Usually a big famine will cover 5%. I think the biggest as a proportion we know is the Irish famine of the 1840s. So that was again a percentage like 10 or 15%, which is relatively large. But how come that becomes such a big issue for the nation? That's because even those who are not affected are able to understand the deprivation that others are suffering. And democracy makes that discussion possible, and that discussion is encouraged. So that's why when the only thing is, which I try to discuss in the book, that India could get democratic practice from Britain, but because that has been practiced in Britain a lot. But on the other hand, it could not be something that the British could have given to India, because you can't run a colonial empire with a democratic political structure. So it's something that could only come from Britain, but couldn't come while the colonial rule. Now, in Britain, what happened, the example you're giving, and there were striking studies about what happened, not only just after the war, but during the war, that fearing that there might not be food for everyone, systems of rationing and food at controlled prices were introduced, and medicine being more equally distributed were introduced. And they naturally, they felt natural in the egalitarian atmosphere of shoulder to shoulder fight on behalf of the nation. And that played a big part, as I discussed in the book, in the emergence of the National Service and ultimately the European welfare state. Now, can it ever work only on that? No. Can it work only on rationing system? Again, no. On the other hand, could we make use of the rationing system when it's badly needed? And the answer is yes. And that has often been the fallback position in situation of dire necessity.
I think, though I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think what I was getting at was there was a will to have, there was a communitarian spirit, if you like, that allowed things like the welfare state and the National Health Service and rationing and all of these things to obtain. I'm wondering if you really believe such a communitarian spirit exists now.
Well, I take the view that Adam Smith did, namely how much communitarian, I wouldn't say communitarian, that's not a language I like, because community could be defined narrowly, like Hindus versus Muslims, like white versus black, uh, and immigrant versus local resident. I would say humanist. Now, the humanist tradition defends, as Adam Smith uh, clearly outlined, uh, you know, thinking about the problem, not far from where this meeting is meant to be, namely Edinburgh, and there the argument was that uh, you have to think about not only who you are, but also that you could have been another person. And he asked, therefore, the enormously helpful exercise of impartial spectator. Had you been a spectator and quite impartial and arrived here, how would you view the inequality that's going on? And if you find something wrong in it, what would you recommend? So I think that is a fillip to, again, not communitarian, but egalitarian thinking between people in a nation. And that could be really very important in any uh, uh, social construction of the kind that we might want to have, and which a welfare state would tend to have, and which, of course, various uh, ideals of socialism have tended to bring in. So there's a totality of concerns that can capture ideas that are deliberately fostered. And here, no one did as much, I believe, as Adam Smith did in the theory of moral sentiment about how to think about inequality and injustice in a situation when you are yourself confined to a position. How can you broaden your outlook?
I want to bring in the audience in a minute because I've got some questions here from elsewhere, and I'm hoping we'll have some questions here in Edinburgh as well, Amartya. But it would be remiss of me to let this portion of the event go without asking you for your opinion on the American presidencies that you've lived through, most especially President Trump and now President Biden.
Well, I was very thrilled when President Biden got elected. He had many features that were quite admirable. But I think what's gone in Afghanistan, and it's a country that I have been interested in for a very long time, uh, going back to the, in fact, Buddhist heritage. Some of the earliest Buddhist schools of thought were actually in Afghanistan. And I'm familiar with the country, I'm familiar with the people. And to decide that since the Americans have been there for 20 years, and now there's nothing more that the Americans could cooperate to achieve, I think showed a certain amount of shallowness in thinking, for which I think America is now paying a serious price. So I would say there's some greatness is perhaps too big a word, but some tremendous merit in his thinking about the world. And yet there is also a narrowness which, if we had avoided life in Afghanistan, for the Afghans and all the countries which take refugees and all the people across the world who look at Afghanistan, where their lives would have been better. So I'm saddened by that.
I want to, if we can have the lights on, see if there's any questions here, because I've got some from elsewhere. Do we have a question? Yes, we've got a question, two in front there, if we may just take them first.
Right. Professor Sen, you've contributed to many fields in economics. Adam Smith regarded the central question as the wealth of the nations, which he defined as GDPs, i.e. based on the income statement. But many today see the capital side as every bit as important as incomes, the investment we're making in the future, sometimes disinvestments in the case of global warming. The top 4 companies in the world actually have a market cap of $7.5 trillion. That compares with the global GDP of $70 trillion, or Britain under 3. So do we not now need to consider the big global oligopoly players to deal with Adam Smith's central question?
Okay, thank you. Professor?
Yeah. I would say this, that the short answer to the substantive point about wanting to broaden our vision, I entirely agree. So there, you and I are on the same side. We are not on the same side is in interpreting Adam Smith. Adam Smith didn't think of wealth of nation only as GDP. In fact, he made quite clear wealth is a much broader virtue. When he's talking about why is it the idea of poverty varies from one country to another, why is it that without having his example, linen shirt and leather shoes, if you don't have them in, say, London, that's a deprivation in a way it would not be if you are in, his example included, French rural picture, certainly would apply to, say, Bangladesh or Nigeria today. Now, what is he pointing out there? He's pointing out that what we regard as wealth depends on how we can lead a life along with others. And if everyone has a linen shirt and leather shoes, if I didn't have it, I'd feel deprived, just as in a modern town like New York or London or Edinburgh, if you didn't have a television or even cable channel, you may not, your children may not be able to take part in the life of the community. That's a phrase that Smith used. And because everybody else has a radio and television, and they know what's going on, whereas you may not. So the value of a commodity depends not only on the price of the commodity, but what the commodity does to human life. And you are giving an example where something broader, something more important than the usual GDP ingredient have to be taken into account. And you have to do that.
I'm conscious of the time, Martin, and I want to take a question from outside this room from Aditi, who says, has the difference between the haves and the have-nots increased in the last decade or so when the technology has advanced to bring the world closer, or at least seemingly closer?
Well, it's not just technology, it's also the ownership inequality have become quite a lot sharper. Technology have its own contribution to that inequality, yes, certainly true. And that's also both a problem and a remedy, because learning new technology, using that technology to catch up with other countries is something within the realm of possibility. So I think we have to think of them as both generating difficulties as well as offering opportunities.
Okay. Now there's a gentleman just behind there who's had his hand up. Yes.
Thank you. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have always had a big influence on the Taliban because of Wahhabism and the spread of Wahhabism. And I want to know the effect now in Pakistan and throughout the Middle East of the Taliban. Thank you.
I'm not sure I fully got the question. What is it that happens in Pakistan, you say?
Well, I mean, there's various parts of the question, Amartya, but principally he wants to know what the effect of the Taliban now is going to be on Pakistan and indeed in the Middle East.
Yeah. You see, Pakistan fitted into Taliban fitted into Pakistani strategic thinking in a rather narrow, focused way in the context of Pakistan versus India and so on. On the other hand, there's a part of Taliban which is a very big problem in Pakistan itself. So I think one has to think of a broader way of looking at the circumstances that had generated the Taliban threat across the world. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, but it's primarily in the in Afghanistan, Gulf area, Pakistan, and so on. Now, there is a lot of concern in Pakistan itself about how to change that narrow way of thinking. So I think ultimately there has to be a recognition that even though Taliban may look like a facility for Pakistan, it may not ultimately be such a facility. We don't have the time, given what we have on the wall, left to discuss that, but we could discuss that. And I have to say, since I'm involved in various groups that bring Pakistanis and Indian and Bangladeshis together to chat about these things, that there is a clear consciousness of such problems among the Pakistani intellectuals today. I mean, if you look at newspapers like Dawn and so on, they take a broader outlook.
Do we have other questions in the audience here? Well, I wonder if I could intrude then with another question, Amartya. You talk about public discussion underpinning democracy and democratic societies, about the fact that if people are given information and can discuss that information, then things might be improved. And yet we're living in a time just now where there are a lot of people in your adopted country in America and in my country here, there are a lot of people who don't want to engage in public discussion. I'm thinking of people who are solidly against vaccination or lockdown or mask wearing or any of these other things. They seem to be deaf to public discussion.
Yes, I think that is a very big problem and to which you are rightly drawing attention. But, I think the remedy of avoiding discussion is to facilitate discussion. And even on the vaccination issue in America, to which you referred, there are clear signs that a whole group of people want to remove that barrier to conversation that's made life in disease confrontation that much more difficult in America. I think there are different types of barriers that we have to overcome. Sometimes the barriers come from narrow-minded thinking. Sometimes they come from governmental autocracy. I regret greatly that in India, often open-minded thoughts are discouraged on grounds that they don't fit in with the government's narrow outlook. We have to fight against that too. So I think in many ways, a broad vision is something which is not only sometimes lucky enough to inherit it, but we can also cultivate, we can also expand, we can also understand the importance of. So I'm very glad you raised that question, because it is very central to the exercise that I'm trying to talk about in my book.
One quick last question about America, because those of us who watched it in real time were appalled at the fact that the seat of democracy in America could be attacked by what, to all intents and purposes, looked like a mob. Why do you think that happened, and what's going to be done about it in terms legally?
What do you have in mind, particularly?
What I have in mind to, well, I wouldn't mind a few of the perpetrators going into jail, but that may just be me.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm fully getting the import of that one.
I'm just asking what you thought about the assault on the Congress building on January the 6th.
Yeah, you mean the Capitol building?
Yes.
Yeah, that of course was a part of a political approach, and those who did it were particularly concerned with preventing Biden from getting the confirmation vote, which occurred at that time, on that day, on the 6th of January, in the Capitol Hill, and they wanted to stop that. So that had a very clear focus. But that, you're right, that is an important problem. But when we face these problems, we ultimately, like in every problem in human life, we have to rely on our reasoning as to why it is happening. And we were not initially clear why was it that such a riot took place on the 6th of January. But it became clear how it linked with the attempt to make Donald Trump, rather than Biden, the president of America. So we have to look at each of the problems in terms of what's particularly causing these concerns.
And we're also going to have to cease this discussion, at least in public, Amartya, because we're out of time. But could I just say that if you want the voice of reason, this is as good a place to start as any. Home in the World is a remarkable volume, as indeed are all Amartya's writings. He is the voice of reason, and he's been the voice of reason for so many decades. And I thank you so much for joining us today. Please join me in...
I'm very grateful. Thank you very much.
I should say, ladies and gentlemen, both here and in the wider world, if you want to buy Home in the World, there is, of course, a festival bookshop here, and there's an online bookshop, and they'll be very happy to sell you copies of it, and so will Amartya be very happy to know that you've done so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.